I'm over the moon to be hosting this webinar with Anna Rose, who is a director from Space Syntax on how to read a city. So welcome, Anna.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here with you all from all over the world.
Fantastic. Well, Anna and I have actually made a friendship over the years over our love of cities and numbers. So I'm absolutely delighted that she can join us today. But first of all, I think it's helpful to say what space syntax is. A space syntax is an approach to analysing space that was developed at the UCL, University College London, with some pioneering work that they did in the 1970s. It then developed into a tool that does a pretty good job at analysing space, which Anna no doubt will tell you more about. And Space Syntax is also the name of a commercial spin out of this research programme that helps public bodies and private organisations take a data-driven approach to the use of space. And they've been doing this for the last 30 years, so they've got a lot of data and case studies to back this up and support their work. And as a financial modeller, I'm much more familiar with numbers than I am with architectural drawings and maps, although both fascinate me. But as a financial modeller working in real estate, the space syntax approach really appeals to me because it converts those drawings and maps into numbers. So I think you'll leave this webinar appreciating that, as magical as it sounds, it's actually possible to tell a lot about a city just by looking at a map of its street and street network, and how the predictable movement of people really can help you read a city. So Anna's going to talk to you for about 20 minutes, then we'll open it up to questions. There's, I think most of us are very experienced in using Zoom and Q&A these days. So yeah, if you could use the Q&A for your questions. And then we'll open it up to those questions after Anna's presentation. And then we'll tell you at the end, so it's just about 40 minutes, and we'll tell you at the end how you can learn a bit more about this approach, and how it can help you make better investment decisions for all you developers and real estate investors out there. So without further ado from me, I will hand over to Anna.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so How to Read a City is the title of this talk. And I just want to say a few words how this came about. So as Natalie mentioned, we've been working together over the last year, talking a lot about city centers and especially how retail works in cities. And there's going to be another webinar in a week's time focusing on this topic in more detail. But while we were doing this, and while especially during this time of the coronavirus, things have changed dramatically about the way how we use cities. We have been thinking we need to do something first where we talk more fundamentally about cities and people and how they use them, because just get to the next slide. Yeah, because after all, cities really depend on people coming together. So we have cities because they generate value, social value and commercial value, because people are coming together for social and economic transaction in them. So while at the moment there's a big question mark about how we can do this, it's very clear to me that the good design of public spaces will play a key role for us coming out of this coronavirus situation, because the design of good public realm will enable us to continue to come together. And we really need to understand what is the impact of cities on people's behavior in order to do this really well. And I think one important part of it, as many people have been talking about, is creating more space, rebalancing space towards people and their positive encounter, away from other functions potentially more related to servicing and mobility, transport, vehicles, and so on. So there have been a lot of discussions, as you know, what can be done in the short and the long term. And we at Space Syntax, we feel at the heart of this discussion, and we feel like we can contribute a lot to our understanding of cities and how we can make them into places where people and societies can thrive. So this image is the more London development between London Bridge and Tower Bridge in central London. And as you can see, this is a space not just for the new office buildings in this area, but it's a space for different types of people using it integrated into the wider context. So my next slide is about our main tool we're using, which is underlying a lot of our analysis and work. So it's a spatial accessibility model you see here, in this case of central London. And it's basically an abstraction of the publicly accessible movement network of the city. So what you see here is a network. It's a collection of segments which are all interconnected. And we have an algorithm which calculates the relationship between all these different segments. And the structure which emerges from this algorithm is something we see in almost every well-established urban system. So in the case of London, you can see this very well. You have this, what we call a foreground network. It's almost like a spider web of the kind of primary connections, the very continuous alignments which connect the outside of the city with the center, and they're all connected with each other, the main alignments. And they tend to attract a lot of activity, movement, movement-dependent land uses like retail, high number of people using all sorts of different transport modes. And where they interconnect these red lines, they tend to be locations of importance for transport interchanges and even higher levels of density and activity. So this is what we call the foreground network of a city. And then you see the kind of more the yellowish, greenish areas, which tend to be slightly more quiet areas compared to the red alignments. And these are the areas which might be a bit more monofunctional. They might be dominated by residential uses, maybe some of these are office areas. So they're slightly more quiet areas, but what is really important is the interplay between these areas and the more global network of the city. So your relationship, this is a very wealthy part of London, but it has quiet street, but at the same time, you're close to what is the most integrated street of all of London, Oxford Street. And we all know that Oxford Street in itself is a huge attractor for people because of the types of land uses, the department stores which have accumulated here. And you would think it's because of that most people are coming here. But in the first instance, someone took the decision to put the first department store here, and it then established itself because it worked really well in this location. And this is a dynamic we see in established cities where they sort of align the spatial structure with the land use structure over time, because if you have something which doesn't really work well in an area because of its relationship with the movement network, it will self-correct over time if the urban structure allows it to do it. So over time, this alignment becomes stronger between what works well and where. Then you can also see areas, I don't know if you can see my hand at the moment, the mouse. So for example, here in the southeast, you see a slightly less interconnected part of the network. And this is an area which had a lot of war damage and has not been rebuilt in an as interconnected way as some of the more longer established areas. And you can see that these blue lines, which are dead ends. So from here, it's much more complicated to get to one of these redder routes, which then connect you to everywhere else. And we use this tool not just to understand existing places, but then to look at master plans and interventions and new connectivity to model what might be the impact, how might these new places function, and also how that would impact on the wider context surrounding them. So it's a very good tool to, first of all, very quickly understand a place and then look at what might be the impact of changing it. So the other thing to say is that this is the kind of basic model we're using, and it can be created fairly quickly. It's a lot less data hungry to start with compared to, let's say, a more traditional traffic model where you need a lot of information. But having said that, at Space Syntax, we are now moving towards integrating this spatial data with a lot of other data sets. And that's part of the development of our methodology, because what you see here is how we tend to integrate when we develop a pedestrian movement forecast model. We tend to integrate the spatial layout, spatial accessibility values, which we know they correlate really well against collected data, empirical data of pedestrian movement. You can see that in this correlation. So we build the statistical model as a basis of predictive models for future scenarios. So we look at an area, observe what's happening there, observe how the relationship between movement and spatial accessibility works, and if it's strong enough to predict for a future scenario what might happen as a result of a new development. But we know that while we know that 60 to 80% of the movement can be explained by this relationship in established urban systems, we know that this correlation even increases when we add other information, such as, for example, for each of these data points, which represent one of the segments in the model, if we add the information of, for example, active frontage, retail frontage, and other type of qualities of that space. So in different projects, we've seen that this helps us to improve the correlation and the accuracy of our model. And the third element we tend to include in our model is the information about access to public transport. So if you have an important station in your area, we know from the empirical surveys and analysis that that would have an impact in the surroundings of the stations. The movement would be higher than expected if you would just look at the spatial layout. So typically in most projects there is some sort of information around what we call the land use attraction, can also be the quantum of development, things like that, the transport attraction, to supplement the already quite strong information we have from the spatial layout, spatial accessibility analysis. And we call this integrated model. Yeah, so the last slide I want to show you is representing even more recent work we've been doing, where we look at not just integrating data related to movement, but looking at other kind of data which are relevant for urban policy. So we're starting to look at how can planning policy be linked to policy in relation to public health, for example. So in this map, you see that this is not a network model. What you see here is the data is represented on the building plot. And what you see here is a representation of how many types of land use you can access within 5-minute walking distance from your building. And we call this land use diversity. And it's one of our attempts to find measures which can describe walkability in urban systems. So we are interested a lot in active travel and urban health. So we're looking at ways of understanding how can we plan the city in a way which enables more people to do most of their journey walking, cycling, using public transport. And so in this image, you can, for example, see that some of the, this is the London Borough of Greenwich, some of the kind of historic town centers are very well served with a high diversity of land uses. But then there are areas of more recent development which are very far away from this diversity. So it means that people are more likely to have to use their car for some of the things they're doing on a day-to-day basis. And how can this be helpful? So we think this can help policymakers to think about, do we need to, for example, locate something here? Do we need to bring some more amenity for people in this area closer to them, so they are also able to have a more healthy day-to-day lifestyle? And this we call integrated modeling, and is one of the areas of main development of the space syntax methodology at the moment, where we're looking at mostly using open source data, which is generally our approach, to create very large models where we look at the relationship between the spatial network and other aspects of our lives in urban societies. And I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Anna. That's really interesting. If we've got any questions, put them in the Q&A, or if you can't access the Q&A, put them in the chat. So I'll just start off myself, if that's okay, Anna. I know a lot of your clients are quite impressed about what you can tell them about the cities that you haven't visited yet, just by looking at the maps of those cities. So what is it that you're telling them that impresses them? What is it that you know that you can tell just from the maps?
Yeah, that's quite interesting, because we basically link the spatial structure to human behavior in this analysis, and we know because we worked in so many cities before that there are these strong relationships. So indeed, sometimes it's quite interesting, and people are wondering, how do we have this information? So if we look at the structure of the city, we tend to ask them question if this represents what's actually happening in their city. For example, we identify a primary route network and make assumptions about the types of functions along that route network. We have questions about the transport infrastructure they have and how that is aligned, and the land uses in the city. So I mean, it's a big advantage that fairly quickly you can dive into understanding the spatial structure. One thing I haven't gone into is that we also look at different spatial accessibility measures, describing what we call local accessibility, which highlights which parts of a network are most important for pedestrian journeys. And that tends to highlight really well things like urban villages or local neighborhood centers. And then on the other hand, which parts of the network, which streets are really important for vehicle movement. And a lot of our projects are actually about making sure that this is well balanced in the different spaces. So if you have a space which is part of the primary network, but also important for pedestrians, we talk about the urban design, which would be appropriate. It would have to be an urban boulevard rather than an urban motorway, for example. And looking at this alignment with our clients is a big part of our job.
And would you be able to kind of highlight that in the context of your London map? Yeah. Sort of what are the busiest routes and what are obvious for cars and stuff from, if you can go back to that slide perhaps.
I'll do that. That's just trying to do that. Yes, so for example, in London, we know that, maybe I come back to Oxford Street as a really kind of obvious example, where this is the most accessible street of all of our London model. At the same time, you can see how it's interlinked at a very high density of intersections to the local grids of the north of Oxford Street and this Mayfair area here. So it means there are lots of opportunities for people to move between the local neighborhood and this alignment, which brings a lot of local activity of pedestrians. It's extremely useful both for pedestrians using these areas here, as well as moving in and out of the area. And that's why it has all these important bus routes going to all sorts of places all over London, because it's one of the most important east-west connections in central London. And that's also the difficulty. As many of you know, there have been attempts to pedestrianize it and make it more pedestrian friendly. And it's a real challenge to find good alternatives for the more global connectivity it provides for the bus routes, for example. So this is a good example. And other examples are also things like the Edgware Road, where it's also really interesting to study how the character of one of these primary routes can change significantly depending on where you are. So the northern part of the Edgware Road, you can see they're very large blocks, and the distance between the intersections are quite long. Whereas in this area, in other parts of it, or again here again, you have a much higher density of intersections, creating those local centers. So suddenly Edgware Road becomes part of a local center for the local people. So it changes dramatically in character along this alignment.
And I sense that you could tell me a lot about any single street I would pick on in that map. So that's how powerful the system is. We've got quite a few questions that are now coming in, so we'll try our best to get through all of them. So we have one from James Mill, and he says, "Thanks, brilliant. How broad are your land use categories in your walkability maps? How far do you define as a 5-minute walk? Is 7 different uses the most you've found in that degree of proximity?" It's quite an interesting question.
Yeah, so in terms of the land use categories we're using, it tends to be shaped by 2 things. One is what we would observe when we come to the area as specifically important to an area. So we, from our observation, we would pick on things and make sure we test them if they have statistical relevance. The other thing is also what kind of data is available for us to use. So we're looking at in different places. You have, we work in different countries. So we try to work as much as possible with open source data. So it depends on what is actually available and what is the unit of the data. So sometimes you get it by building, sometimes you only get it by small areas. So you have to be flexible in the way how you link the non-spatial data with the spatial network. And that's also one of the technical challenges. Depending on that, we have different ways of linking the data sets. And the other part of the question was about the walking radius.
Yes, so how do you define a 5-minute walk?
We're looking at, and I think this is based on TfL guidance, the 5-minute is a 400-meter walking radius. So 400 meters roughly equates 5 minutes. So that's what we're working with. But again, this might also be different in different places, and we might adapt it to that.
And 7 different uses, is that the maximum you found in there?
I don't think so. I think I've seen longer
longer lists.
But sometimes we also find that some of them don't really matter much, and then we test a lot of them. For example, we might be testing catering versus retail versus office buildings, and we might find that that there's a really noticeable, statistically relevant impact of retail, but not of the doors to office buildings. So we would often, in these multivariable models, where you here just see pedestrian movement and spatial accessibility, we would bring, maybe 10 different variables and test the model. We have like a big statistical matrix, and we look at what parameters actually have statistical relevance, and then isolate those and say, okay, in this area we can see there's a statistical relevant impact of, for example, in some places we found that blank frontages, and in this case we had data on females using the area. They would be slightly avoiding an area which had a lot of blank frontages at ground floor level, but we didn't find that relationship when we looked at the male population. So it can be
Okay,
very interesting.
So we've got another question for Victoria Song. What kind of open source data are fed into the space syntax system, and where normally would you source them from? I think you've answered a bit of that already, but is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, in the UK, we're working with the census data set.
Okay, and then for you have to apologise for my pronunciation of your name. So Otter Bit Iki. So I do apologise if I've not pronounced that correctly. How reliable do you think space syntax methodology can be utilised in very hilly cities? Is slope represented in calculations? Very interesting.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one, which comes up again and again. And the interesting thing is that we looked at cities like San Francisco or Seattle, and we still find these strong relationships between the spatial layout and pedestrian movement. And what you find typically in cities like that, when you have, let's say, one of the primary routes going up the hill, that tends to have at some point the introduction of a tram or something to overcome that let's say cost to movement. So what we think we can help cities which have this challenge to identify where would be the biggest impact if I invest in infrastructure to overcome this problem. And of course, the introduction of e-bikes and e-mobility in the kind of more micro mobility area is extremely powerful tool to enable this. But it seems like that the way we read the city and navigate the city is related to our physiology and how we as human beings engage visually and physically with the environment. And if we then have obstacles to overcome, we can actually identify where would be the biggest impact or benefit of doing that.
And again, I think a similar question, but on slightly different attributes from Song-Yu Wang. Can attributes of the network be considered stroke analysed in space syntax? For example, width of path or sheltered versus open space?
Yes, you can do that. So what you can do if you have a network, you can map these parameters. For every segment, you could assign, for example, the width of the street, or if it has cover. And then you just throw it into your statistical model and see if it has an impact. So I think that would be very easy to identify if actually people care about that cover or not so much. Would be a good proof to see if that's if that really has a big impact, or people they just accept that they are exposed in certain places. But then it helps again to identify where should you focus your covering of the areas if you understand what are the hierarchies.
Okay, so it enables to kind of focus your attention really on those spaces. Again, I think a lot of items have been covered in this this question, but I think there's probably a couple of new bits. And this is from Ege Dosemichi. What are your assumptions for analysis other than possible retail number that you just mentioned? And which data is derived from which source? Lastly, how do you test the accuracy of the data? How can the data be more detailed and accurate?
Yeah, so for example, when we look at using this in the context of new developments, we would receive data from the developer and the project team about things like how many, what is going to be the new population of this area. So we would have quite detailed population and land use data from the development team. So we would have to rely on the accuracy of the sources for that. And that allows us to build quite detailed local models. And sometimes we also develop what's more known as agent modeling. That's a slightly different methodology. When you have this very detailed data, you can almost simulate flows in more detail. The challenge is always when you have this very detailed data for your project site, but then you have much coarse data of the wider urban context, and how you marry those data sets, and how the transition of those would work. So that can be quite challenging. And then the other data source in projects is often when people submit planning applications. So we always look at a future scenario, not just looking at the development on our site, but also on all the expected other developments in the wider area, let's say within 2 kilometers from the site. Since we tend to focus on looking at pedestrian movement, that kind of context doesn't have to be huge. If we were to predict sort of more global, larger journeys, we would have to have much bigger data sets. But I mean, that is always, for us, is always a challenge when we start in a place, what kind of data is available. We have been collecting a lot of data, doing our own surveys of the physical environment, of things like the kind of built environment infrastructure, like pedestrian crossings, railings, quality of the environment, width of pavements, and things like that, when it's not readily available. And of course, we undertake a lot of pedestrian movement surveys. Now, at the moment, this is a big challenge because we don't have normal movement patterns because of coronavirus and people behaving very differently. So now we're looking at building the model slightly more based on data about the buildings, about the quantum of development, and the number of people associated with that quantum of development. So we have to bring in more assumptions.
Okay, I think we've probably just got a couple more minutes for questions, and there's a lot coming in. So if we don't get through all of them, we probably won't. Then I'm sure Anna will be happy to answer questions offline as well. But we've got a question from David. How do you suggest us to compare space syntax theories and classic simulation? I presume the classic simulation transport model.
Yeah, okay, so the classic transport model is based more on sort of an approach of creating zones, and it's more like a gravity model. So you need a lot of assumptions on origins and destinations between different parts of the city, and that is then creating a matrix to build your model. So basically, you're building a model, you're basically telling the model what to do. By inputting all these assumptions. Space syntax model is slightly different because you take the spatial network as almost like a manifestation of the movement structure. So over time, this structure has emerged as a result of the movement patterns, and it has evolved and optimized itself and adapted itself to different things. So it's almost like a frozen picture of the movement structure, which we then, that's why how to read a city. So we can use this to then draw out of this what the movement structure might be. And I think that was the big moment at the beginning of the space syntax research, when they started out basically trying to find a mathematical way to explain the geometry of the city in an objective mathematical way. When they realized this correlates so well with movement patterns they observed, that was a sort of moment that they realized this can be used to build a movement model, but it's a different approach.
And I quite like this question, so I'll just try and squeeze this one in from Durantina. Can space syntax help us track the hotspots of vulnerability, thermal stress in terms of urban climate change? Yeah, presumably looking at density and carbon emissions, etc.
Yeah, I mean, what we can understand is, for example, a certain urban layout will result in longer journeys compared to another layout which has stronger interconnectivity. So that's the average distance between places would be much lower than, let's say, in cul-de-sac type urban layout. You wouldn't be able to go through a street to get somewhere else. You always would have to turn back on yourself and double up on your journey and have longer journeys. So that would basically create what we think is a more carbon intense city, because you would have to travel longer journeys, so you're more likely to use a car to do that. We're not really looking at the kind of building fabric and building physics in terms of the use of energy in the buildings for heating and energy and so on. So, but we are working together with a company, an energy company, who is transitioning from fossil fuels to green energy. And they are looking at repurposing former power station sites into urban developments. And then they also have areas where they're working with thermal heat networks, and they have established networks and they're thinking about extending them. And we work with them to think about, they think about what works well for the energy network, and we look at what works well for the kind of urban network, and trying to marry these things because there's slightly different practicalities involved. Yeah.
So it's an additional tool, which is obviously very useful. If we could just go to the last slide, and I'll just talk about next steps. So Anna's very kindly agreed to do yet another webinar with us next week. So if you want to, I noticed there are a few questions on how to learn more about this approach, which is fantastic. So Anna will go into that in more depth next week, so please do join that. And before you leave, perhaps copy and paste the chat into a Word document on your computer, because that's no longer there once we obviously once you leave the chat. So just copy those links in, and I can tell you what those links are. The link to join the webinar, I mean, you could click on that straight away and get yourself registered. Also, Space Syntax do have a few online materials that can help tell you a little bit more about the method, but as I say, we'll go into it in detail, a bit more detail next week. And also because we're doing quite a lot on retail, and retail's very it has been obviously as a pressing issue for a long time, but just of late it's added a few more factors into the discussion over high streets and shopping centres and so on. So we have designed a course alongside Space Syntax on spatial layout and retail performance. So that's a day-long course which will go through the method and we'll also have some useful takeaways on how to really understand space in a quantitative fashion. So actually look at the high street and extract some numbers to help you inform when you read all these newspaper articles about the high street dying and so on. You can really understand it in the context of that. So sign up to that webinar. So we'll see you next week on that, and then do have a look at the outline of the course. If you need any more information, contact Veronica Bayfield. The email address and the phone numbers at the bottom there, but contact anyone at Bayfield. If you look at our website, you'll be able to get hold of someone there. And if you've been attending our webinars, which I know a lot of you have, if you attend 5 of them, you get a fantastic 20% off. So perhaps you can use that against the spatial layout and retail performance course. So just before I go, I'm just 1 minute over time, but I think we can keep you for another minute if you'll let us. If Anna, did you want to say anything about the course on the 17th of September? I know you'll chat to us a bit more about it next week as well.
Yeah, so I think the course would be a good opportunity to understand in more detail how we apply this to real projects and what are the processes involved in that. So if you are a planner, part of a consultant team working on a project like this, if you are part of a client team, or of a local authority, I think it would be relevant for all of you to understand how this method can help, because it's also a great way of communicating issues across the different disciplines involved in the development process. And as Natalie said, it will also point to a number of online resources we have developed at Space Syntax, which are publicly available, where if you want to take the next steps.
I think we've put that in
the,
yes, I should have mentioned that. I think that's been, but Sophia's put that in the chat as well. So you've got, you can actually look at that map of London, I think through the open mapping link that we put there, or something very similar to that, for the whole of of England, at least, probably all of the UK, I think you may have on there. So yeah, have a look at that as well when you copy and paste that in. But hopefully we'll see you all next week. Thank you very much, Anna, and see you at the webinar on the 15th of July. Thank you very much, everyone from all over the world, for attending.